The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
We can learn a few things from Singapore, says Ernst Lang, the founder and CEO of Promerita Group. Singapore has been getting housing right for many decades. In fact, it has found a way to make most of its housing affordable while at the same time protecting the value of privately owned homes. According to a report by the Urban Land Institute, private homes in Singapore are the most expensive in Asia, with an average price of, get this, 1.7 million. That makes them the most expensive. That's the average price of a home here in Vancouver. However, the ULI report states that public housing in Singapore is the most attainable when it comes to home ownership. 90% of the people in the country own their own home. Lang says even more remarkable is the cost in relation to median annual income. In Singapore, the median home price to income ratio is 5. In Vancouver, according to rates.ca, the average home price is 249% more than an average household can afford. How and what are they doing in Singapore that we can learn from? I invited Ernst Lang of Promerita to join me for a conversation that matters about Singapore's housing market and what lessons we may be able to apply here. Ernst, welcome.
Thank you, Stuart. It's a pleasure to be here.
Singapore is a miracle in so many ways. But central to their success has been their housing philosophy.
Absolutely.
How has it played itself out, and why is it so important to understand that making affordable housing attainable is important to quality of life and also a contribution to economy?
Sure. I mean, maybe it's helpful to understand the context in terms of how Singapore formed as a country.
Right.
So Singapore used to be a member of the Malaysian Confederation, and in the 60s, it essentially was kind of kicked out of the Malaysian Federation. It depends on who you talk to, which side you talk to, but long story short, it sort of left the Malaysian Confederation and became a country. But it was not given much to start with. So Singapore at the time is an island, a small island. At the time, it was 580 square kilometers. That's it. And today, it's actually an island of only 728 square kilometers. So that's kind of an allusion to kind of the miraculous part of Singapore.
Right.
They've actually increased their land size by about 25%.
That's by extending their shoreline out into
extending the shoreline. And, you know, if you think about the cost of actually creating land, like 25% more land in your country, it gives you a sense of the incredible economic miracle that's behind that.
Right.
To give you a sense, in a Canadian context, that would be like Canada adding land, creating land equal to the size of British Columbia and Ontario and most of the Maritimes.
Yeah.
Okay, think about the cost of
Yeah.
doing that. And think about it, this is a country that has no natural resources. When it started off as a nation, it didn't have enough water, fresh water. It was forced to rely on piping fresh water from Malaysia. Mm-hmm. And it had a relatively poorly educated population. It had no education system to speak of, and many people lived in slums. So if you take a look at some of the housing settlements in Singapore at the time, they kind of look like the worst slums that exist in the world today. So how do you go from that to the Singapore of the Crazy Rich Asians movie?
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
And what role did home ownership play in that transformation?
I would argue it actually plays the central role in the economic miracle of Singapore. Because what happened was Singapore was blessed with a founding prime minister, a fellow named Lee Kuan Yew, who was incredibly intelligent, well-educated, and visionary. And he also had a very strong sense of pragmatism. So he was the leader of the PAP, which was the People's Action Party, which was actually the roots are, it's a socialist party.
Yeah. Well, I understand he won by 1 vote.
Yeah, I've heard that. I haven't, but he barely squeaked in, really as leader. But he turned that 1 vote into, I think, 65 years of continual government, largely because of the success, how successfully he and the party were able to manage the country and manage the development of the country. So I would say the primary difference that I see in terms of how Singapore approached housing versus how we do housing here in Canada is housing is fundamentally viewed as core and essential social and economic infrastructure. Because Lee Kuan Yew, it's basically infrastructure. Because Lee Kuan Yew recognized that in order to have a successful country, you need to have a successful economy. But if you have a country that has no natural resources, the only type of economy, only sort of contributor to building economy will be your people. But how can you successfully build a thriving people-based economy if you don't house them? Right. So it's pretty practical thought process.
And you can make that argument anywhere. You can make that argument here.
Oh, absolutely.
Like without being able to have affordable housing,
yeah,
it changes the dynamics of the economy dramatically.
Totally, because you have like if you contrast the current situation that we have in Canada, and particularly in a place like Vancouver, think about how much energy and stress is created, the baseline energy and stress that's created in a population when so many people, the vast majority of people, are just worried about keeping a roof over their heads. So how much sort of additional capacity and bandwidth do you have to contribute to economy? One good example of that, one proof point of that, is that in British Columbia, between real estate and construction, those two components of our GDP, they comprise about 30% of our total provincial GDP. In Singapore, those two components, construction and real estate, are less than 10%. They're about 9% of GDP. So think about the advantage that Singapore has over the British Columbia economy, where you have additional, more than 20% of GDP can go to other things.
Right.
Like more productive uses and
especially services and products that can be exported, which helps to grow an economy.
Exactly, and that has led to Singapore having a tremendous high per capita GDP rate, as well as income.
Yeah.
So when I was actually born in Singapore, and this is part of the reason why I sort of tracked the development of the country, because I immigrated here with my family in the mid-1970s. And at that time, part of the reason my parents chose to immigrate to Canada was that Canada was seen as a land of opportunity for many immigrants around the world. And under Pierre Elliott Trudeau's very sort of welcoming pro-immigrant kind of policies, visible minority immigrants in particular, felt that Canada was a relatively more tolerant, more welcoming society where people could have a good opportunity to build a good life and a good for themselves and their family. And at the time we moved to Canada, per capita income in Singapore was about 1/4 or 1/5 Canadian per capita income.
Today?
Today, it's over double.
It's double what Canadian per capita income is.
It's over double what Canadian per capita income is. So, in fact, I think the last sort of ranking of per capita income in the world, it was number 3 on the planet, after Luxembourg, Ireland, and Singapore.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
So how did they arrange their real estate market then? Because in the introduction, I talked about the fact that they do recognize, this free market sector, but the major portion of the Singaporean real estate market is controlled by the government.
Yeah, well, actually, to be specific, the residential aspects.
Yes,
so
residential.
So housing specifically. So the way it works in Singapore is they calibrate supply and demand. Okay, but the reason they do that, and this is how they do that. Firstly, first thing I should say, they do not prevent private developers from developing private housing. They don't prevent them from doing that. However, they do such a good job at developing publicly developed housing that private development of housing is focused on just the ultra luxury end of the marketplace. And so Singapore has a agency or crown corporation called the Housing Development Board. Mm-hmm. And the Housing Development Board has developed 80% of the entire country's housing stock.
80%?
Yes. The style of development would be, I think, the closest analog to the way they approach their housing development would be UBC Property Trust.
Okay.
So at University of British Columbia, there's UBC Property Trust that controls all the lands there, that controls the zoning,
yeah.
And they offer the lands to be developed under long-term leases, 99-year leases.
The same way that they did on the south shore of False Creek.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And so the HDB in Singapore, the HDB developed housing that is available for purchase is developed in a similar kind of tenure.
Right, where you don't actually have title to the land.
No, you don't. But you have title to your home. And
so in Singapore, you would have title to your home, whereas it looks like when you take a look at the model, let's say on the south shore of False Creek,
right,
you don't actually have title to your home. It's almost more like you're buying a 20-year rental. Like you don't take away any value. It's not like you would if you owned the land.
Yeah. So in the 80% of the housing stock that's the housing stock that's developed by HDB.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the government owns the land.
Okay.
But it's actually not that different in many other countries. Like some of the most expensive real estate in the UK, in London, like in Belgravia, is ultimately owned by the Crown. So those 30 million pound townhomes that are owned by international oligarchs or whatever, a lot of those lands in Belgravia are actually ultimately owned by the Crown, and they are on long-term leases.
But it's a long-term lease on the land, but the structure itself, they have title to.
Yes, and what happens is every Singaporean is allowed to buy one to live in, and that's the key point.
That's it.
You can't buy it for investment purposes because housing is viewed as not as an asset class to be traded. HDB housing is there to be lived in. It's a home, and everyone is allowed to buy one to live in, and they can sell it to another Singaporean who's going to buy it to live in, or they can sell it back to the government. So there are different schemes that allow to do that, allow Singaporeans to have a marketplace to buy and sell their homes, to provide liquidity in the marketplace, but also they're also protecting the demand. They're calibrating the demand by doing that. So if, as a foreigner, if I don't have Singaporean citizenship and I'm working there, for example, as an expat, I do not have the right to buy an HDB home.
But you could buy a private home.
I could buy a private home, or I could just rent from the rental market. So I think it's basically the housing issue is a basic supply and demand issue. So you have to have a well-managed housing system, you need to calibrate both. And you have to ensure that the gap between supply and demand isn't too big. Mm-hmm. If you have 10,000 households living in any jurisdiction, you can't, it's basic common sense that you need to have 10,000 homes.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Like at least, and probably a few more extra for that turnover and for, the transient population, the temporary resident population in any marketplace. So that's the big problem that I see that we've created for ourselves in Canada. Because of the nature of our political cycle and the fact that the culture in Canada and the bureaucratic culture in Canada seems to be more process-oriented versus outcome-oriented. The combination of that kind of culture with the lack of long-range planning and the lack of sort of holistic systems thinking and second-order, consideration for second-order consequences or third-order consequences has led to, and this is not I'm not blaming any particular government because this issue has taken many years to develop to the sense to the extent that it's currently at.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
So you point out that we have a couple of models, and one of them, I referred to the south shore of Falls Creek.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of those leases that went out in the 70s were coming up for renewal.
Right.
And they've been extended for 5 years. But at the end of that 5-year period, it's unclear as to what's going to happen next. And so with that kind of uncertainty, is there an opportunity for us still to be able to look at ways of incorporating the Singaporean model here in British Columbia that ensures that housing supply stays within that class?
Absolutely. The challenges are, we've actually done something like this in Canada before. So in the Second World War, as the Second World War created a massive transformation of the Canadian economy in the sense that that was essentially the trigger that jumpstart the industrialization of Canada. And then there was a housing crisis in the urban areas because people needed to move from the countryside into urban areas to staff the factories that were needed to build ships and help support the war movement. So there was a housing crisis that occurred overnight in the urban areas, and the federal government created wartime housing.
Yes, they did.
And which is a predecessor to CMHC.
Mm-hmm.
So the federal government actually actively developed housing. And between 1945 or 44 and for the decade after, we built wartime housing, and CMHC built like 1.2 million homes.
Well, you see all those, what they call Vancouver specials all over the city.
Actually, they call it, they're actually the strawberry box homes.
Yeah.
The Vancouver specials are after.
Oh, they came later.
They came later. But at the time, the post-war population of Canada was 12.5 million people. So we built the equivalent of 10% of our entire country's population, worth of homes in about 8 or 9 years. So that would be equivalent to us currently building 4.1 million homes.
Wow.
4.1 million homes in a fairly short order.
Right.
So I believe implicitly, there's the only thing stopping us from solving our housing problem in Canada is ourselves. And really, there's no technical reason. There's no financial reason. Canada is a G7 country, and even though our excuse me, even though our relative wealth has eroded since the 70s to today, we're still a very wealthy nation. We have a strong financial strength ratings. We have a very educated populace, and we're a desirable place to live. We have all the tools to solve our own housing problem. The question is, do we have the political will and the political courage and the willingness to be practical versus process-oriented in our government systems?
Well, that's a valid question.
Yeah.
And but I'm trying to think of what the mechanisms would be. Let's take just the city of Vancouver. How do we start to introduce this kind of housing in a way that it will give access to affordable housing for a considerable number of people, and be manageable, and can be introduced with a long-term plan to build it out?
So, if I can pose the question differently and just confirm, you asked me, if you were to ask me, Ernest, what would you do if you were in charge of all the levers that are available to government to solve the housing?
And your answer
problem?
is?
The answer would be, I would form a government-sponsored housing development corporation, okay? That would have the authority to essentially do its own zoning and do its own permitting and just build the stuff.
So that would speed up the
Totally. So in other words, if we created a version of, let's just say, if you think about it, the powers that municipalities administer for zoning, they actually come from the provincial government.
Yes, they do.
They don't exist at the municipal level. They exist at the provincial government.
Right.
So if I were to advise the Premier, what would I do? I would create a provincial housing development corporation and basically use the Crown land. There's a lot of Crown land held by both municipalities and the province, and entitle it, so zone it, upzone it dramatically. And just the fact of changing the zoning on unentitled land, and if you entitle it, increases its value from a financing perspective.
Do you even have to create that entity? Don't we have it in BC Housing in a way?
I guess technically, BC Housing could be empowered to do that.
But it's a question of being given the mandate to do this.
Given the mandate, and also I do think we have the problem is, there was actually a very interesting academic book that studied and reported on Singapore's housing, the success of Singapore's housing system. And one of the things it noted was that the culture of the HDB, the Housing Development Board, was radically different from most government bureaucracies. It talks about how the management culture is actually more similar to that of a for-profit multinational. So
because they were accountable.
Yes, totally.
Financially.
Yeah. So it was much less process-oriented and much more outcome-oriented. Like the mandate was focused on outcomes.
And so that could be a possible way.
And it can be hard to take an existing culture and change it. You know, it's sometimes easier to start from a blank slate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So are you encouraged that there are people listening to this as a possible remedy for this housing crisis that we're finding ourselves in?
Yeah, I'm actually seeing quite a few things that are encouraging me. I find encouraging, at least at a policy level. So recently, the city of Burnaby announced the creation of the Burnaby Housing Authority. The council, I think, passed that support last year, but the board has actually recently been formed. I think it was announced in the last week or so. And their mandate is essentially to create a municipally owned housing development company to start developing housing. I think that's a great idea.
Well, I think it's a great idea, and Burnaby once again is showing leadership. It's an extraordinarily well-managed city.
Yes.
And it doesn't surprise me that they would be stepping up and looking for solutions such as this.
Yeah, so I think they're demonstrating at least they could be an example that other municipalities could potentially emulate. I'm also seeing a lot of leadership at the provincial level, under Premier Eby. His government has put in place many forward-looking and pro-housing kind of policies. They haven't yet gone as far as creating a Crown Corp, but my guess is they're probably seeing if the municipalities will step up. And it's nice to see something like a community like Burnaby stepping up. But I think this jury's still out in the sense that sometimes I was mentored by a fellow who's now passed. He was a very senior guy at HSBC Bank, and he used to always say, in business, the best strategy can always be undermined and is trumped by poor execution. So I think many of the ideas that we're seeing are very good. The question now becomes, how well will they be executed? How good is the management and the leadership?
Well, we definitely need a wide variety of approaches and ideas to be able to address what is an ongoing challenge, affordable housing. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, Stuart. Nice to be here.